The storm had passed, leaving the North Carolina coast draped in silver mist. Alone on his fishing boat, a battle-worn veteran tightened his grip on the rod as it bent with impossible weight. At first, he thought it was a rock, a snag on the seabed, but then the winch groaned and a massive shape broke the surface. Dripping with seaweed and barnacles, an ancient wooden chest slammed onto the deck, its iron bands rattling like chains of a ghost long forgotten. As he reached for it, his German shepherd bristled, ears forward, growling low, because inside that chest something shifted, something alive in memory, something that had waited 150 years to be found. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The evening sky over the North Carolina coast carried a weight of clouds, thick and restless, as if the ocean had exhaled its moods into the air. Mason Cole sat at the stern of his small aluminum fishing boat, the kind of vessel meant for one man and, one loyal companion, with the steady hiss of water beneath and the occasional slap of waves against the hull. The man was 58 years old, broad-shouldered but weathered, his skin sun-creased and burnt from years exposed to light that neither forgave nor forgot. His hair, silver-cropped short, betrayed both discipline and age, and a faint scar along his left forearm whispered of battles long past. Once, Mason had been part of the U.S. Army, a soldier hardened by desert campaigns and jungles where humidity stuck to the lungs. Now, years removed from orders and barracks, he lived by the shore, chasing fish more for rhythm than sustenance. Fishing was not simply a pastime, it was ritual, his way of keeping silence from collapsing inward. Beside him, sprawled on the wet deck yet ever alert, lay Kaiser, a 7-year-old German shepherd who had once been a military working dog. The animal was powerful, coat of black and tan gleaming even in the fading light, ears constantly pricked at each sound of gull or wave. A thin scar crossed the dog's muzzle, the mark of an old mission, and when the wind picked up, Kaiser's amber eyes glowed with both sharpness and an undertone of weariness, as though memory still clung to him as stubbornly as it clung to Mason. The dog's harness bore a simple metal plate engraved K9 Retired, a quiet badge of service. Mason sometimes looked at Kaiser with a mixture of pride and pity, knowing they were alike, both discarded tools of war, living quietly at the edge of the map. The line of Mason's fishing rod twitched, then jerked with sudden force. He leaned forward, muscles tightening. His first thought was that the hook had caught on a reef or a forgotten net, but as the rod bent dangerously, he felt a rhythm in the pull, something heavy and awkward resisting against the current. With the grunt, he planted his boots on the slick floorboards, gripping the rod with gloved hands, his yellow waterproof jacket bright against the gathering dusk. The boat shifted uneasily under the tension, and Kaiser rose immediately, ears erect, growl rumbling low in his chest. "Easy, boy," Mason muttered, though his own heart thumped with something closer to unease than calm. The man's mind still carried the instincts of soldiering. Every unknown weight could be a trap, every sound a signal. Fishing was supposed to be predictable, a line cast into water, a catch reeled in, nothing more. But tonight the Atlantic had other ideas. He clipped the rod to the small winch, hands moving automatically with the kind of practiced efficiency that soldiers never quite lose. The winch groaned as he cranked, the rope scraping taut. Slowly, reluctantly, something massive emerged from the water's dark surface. At first it looked like a shape made of shadow itself, coated with seaweed, barnacles, and the rough kiss of time. Then the form sharpened. a long wooden chest, reinforced with iron bands corroded to a greenish black. It was not buoyant like driftwood. It dragged itself upward as though reluctant to leave the sea. When the chest thudded onto the deck, the boat rocked violently, water splashing over the sides. Mason staggered but held steady, his breath clouding in the chill air. The chest was larger than any tackle box, heavier than any crate he had ever pulled from docks. Its sides were swollen with decades of seawater, edges scarred with barnacle growths like pale, crusted wounds. He crouched over it, hand brushing against the slick surface, and in that touch came a shock, not of electricity but of recognition. There was order here, deliberate design. This was not debris. This had been built to hold something meant to endure. Inside the chest, something shifted with a dull metallic clank. Mason froze. His spine stiffened, and he felt the weight of silence crowding in, broken only by Kaiser's sudden growl. The dog's hackles lifted, tail stiff, body between Mason and the chest as though guarding him from what lay inside. Mason's mouth went dry. His mind began to spool through possibilities. He thought of war stories, smugglers in jungles who buried weapons in oil drums, crates found years later still holding rifles wrapped in grease. He thought of whispered tales told by fishermen at the local bar about old wrecks along this coast, ships from the Civil War that never reached harbor. Mason shook his head. Such stories were always exaggerated, and yet the chest before him was too real to dismiss. He pressed his gloved hands along the rim. The iron bolts were fused with rust, the wood groaning with age. Whoever had built it had wanted it sealed against time, against discovery. A strange shiver ran down his spine. Why here? Why now? The sea had countless secrets. What made it give up this one to him? Kaiser's growl softened into a whine, the dog circling the chest, nose pressing against the seams. Mason swallowed hard, feeling the pull of his own curiosity gnaw at the edges of caution. He had spent years trying to still his restless mind, trying to quiet the soldier in him who always demanded answers, strategies, missions. Yet here, on this quiet, storm-thickened night, that soldier stirred again. He glanced at the shoreline barely visible through the haze, the lantern at his dock just a faint point of light. He was alone but for the dog. The chest sat like an accusation, heavy and silent, daring him to act. Mason felt the pulse in his temples, the old ache of adrenaline, the echo of what it once meant to make decisions in split seconds. He no longer had commanders, no fellow soldiers watching his back. The choice was his alone. Bending closer, he pressed his ear to the lid. Nothing but the faint creak of wood, responding to the boat's motion. Yet the memory of that metallic clank remained. He considered leaving it tied, hauling it to shore without looking. But even as the thought formed, he knew he would not resist. Curiosity had already won. The war had taught him one thing above all. Once a question entered the mind, unanswered, it became a burden heavier than any chest. The wind picked up, cold against his cheek. He exhaled slowly, running his hand along the coarse grain of the wood. He imagined the men who had built it, the hands that had hammered the bolts into place, the intent that had sealed it shut. He felt like an intruder into a story that was not his. Yet, at the same time, something within whispered that perhaps it had been waiting, drifting across decades of storms until his line had found it. Mason straightened, shoulders squaring against the pull of doubt. "Looks like it's you and me tonight, old boy," he said quietly, and Kaiser, ears twitching, barked once in reply. As the first drops of rain spattered across the deck and the horizon groaned with thunder, Mason reached for the winch rope again, securing the chest tightly against the side. He would not open it now, not in the storm. But the decision had been made. Whatever lay inside would not remain hidden much longer. The dog circled once more before settling by Mason's boots, eyes still fixed on the silent riddle of wood and iron. Together, man and animal braced themselves against the gathering night, knowing without words that their lives had just shifted, that the ocean had delivered not just weight, but a destiny neither had sought. The storm did not ease until late into the night, its voice hammering across the coast with a relentless rhythm that kept Mason Cole awake long after he had pulled the boat back to his dock. Rain lashed at the roof of his weather-beaten shack. Wind hissed through the thin seams of the windows, and all the while his thoughts circled back to the heavy chest lashed down with rope at the end of the pier. The chest felt less like a discovery, and more like a presence, as though some other will had slipped ashore with him. Sleep was impossible. At one point, Mason lit the lantern in his small kitchen, poured himself a measure of black coffee, and sat staring at the glow, imagining the weight of what he had brought back. Kaiser lay on the floorboards at his feet, restless, ears twitching with every gust. The dog had not barked since they tied the chest down, but his breathing was shallow, and each time the storm rattled the house, his head would lift, nose toward the door, waiting. By morning, the clouds had broken into uneven fragments of gray, the air heavy with salt and pine. Mason, shoulders stiff from a night of half-sleep, pulled on his yellow waterproof jacket again, tugged the cap low, and whistled for the dog. Kaiser rose at once, tail low, eyes focused as if knowing they would be returning to the dock. Together they stepped onto the wet planks, boots thudding against wood still slick from rain. The chest sat there exactly as he had left it, the rope soaked and dark, drops of water clinging to the rusted metal bands. Mason crouched, studying it more carefully now in daylight. The chest was massive, nearly the length of his torso, its wood swollen but remarkably intact, as though whatever craftsman had built it had intended for it to defy both time and tide. The iron bolts securing the lid were thick, their surfaces corroded to a green-black crust, and patches of barnacle still clung to the seams. Mason brushed his glove across the lid and felt the faint grooves of markings, too shallow to read beneath the grime. He fetched a stiff bristle brush from the shed and began to scrape carefully. Slowly the surface revealed itself. Letters carved in a style unfamiliar to the modern eye. They spelled out E.H. Beside them was a small compass rose etched into the wood, nearly erased by time but still visible. The initials set a hook in Mason's memory. E.H. His grandfather had spoken those letters in half-forgotten stories told on summer evenings. Elijah Harper, the name had been. A man Mason's family never fully agreed about. Some saying he had been a sailor, others a smuggler, others whispering of a free man who guided the desperate during the Civil War. Mason remembered laughing it off as a child, but now those letters stared back at him, carved deep and deliberate. Kaiser padded forward, sniffing intently along the base of the chest. The dog's claws tapped against the wet wood, then he scratched twice at a corner of the bottom panel. Ears forward, tail stiff. Mason frowned. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, leaning down. The dog barked once, sharp, then nosed again at the same spot. Mason ran his hand along the seam and felt a subtle give, a faint difference in texture as though the chest had more than one layer. The idea of a hidden compartment sent a chill through him. He set aside the thought for the moment and focused on the bolts. With effort, he jammed the edge of a crowbar beneath one rusted clasp and pried. The metal screamed in protest, flakes of corrosion falling away, until finally, with a snap, the bolt gave. Kaiser barked once more, the sound echoing over the quiet water. Mason worked his way along the lid, each bolt requiring force until his shoulders burned, but eventually the seal broke and the chest groaned open. A breath of musty air, the smell of oil and salt-soaked fabric, drifted upward. Inside lay bundles wrapped in heavy oilcloth. The fabric darkened to near black with age. Mason pulled one carefully aside and revealed a smaller wooden box within, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. Next to it lay a silver locket, chain broken but the oval case surprisingly unspoiled. Mason held it up, fingers trembling. When he thumbed the clasp, it opened with a faint click, and inside rested a faded portrait of a woman. Her hair was styled in the manner of the mid-1800s, coiled and severe, yet her expression was gentle, her eyes soft even through the faded pigment. On the reverse was an engraving. "To my steadfast hand in the storm." Mason's throat tightened. The words struck him like an echo from the past, tying back to the letters on the lid, tying back to stories he had half dismissed. He imagined Elijah Harper holding this locket, imagined the woman who had given it, imagined storms and choices long buried. He shut it gently, his hands trembling slightly, and placed it carefully back among the oilcloth bundles. There was also a map, rolled and bound with frayed string. Mason unwrapped it slowly, spreading it on the dock. The parchment was brittle, but still legible, ink lines marking coastlines, currents, and notations in Lupin script. Some points were circled, small inlets and coves along this very coast. At the top corner, faint words read, "Safe Passage." Mason stared at it until his vision blurred, heart pounding. The bundles, the map, the locket, all suggested more than wealth. They suggested purpose. The chest was not simply storage, it was evidence, perhaps testimony. Kaiser whined softly, pawing again at the base, as though reminding Mason of the hidden layer he had not yet explored. Mason pressed the wood, confirming that the dog was right. There was space beneath. But exhaustion from the storm and the weight of what he had already seen pressed down on him. He would not pry further today. For a long time, Mason remained crouched beside the chest, staring at the initials E.H. The compass rose, the silver locket glinting faintly in his hand. He thought of his grandfather, a wiry man with white hair and a voice made rough by decades of labor. That man had believed in stories, believed in heritage, even when the younger generations laughed. Mason had not understood then, but now he felt the pull of connection, bloodline stretching backward through centuries, whispering through wood and iron. As the day wore on, gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the quiet lapping of water. Mason finally rose, back aching, and secured the chest with canvas and rope once more. His mind was not calm. It was racing, filling with questions that no one else could yet answer. Elijah Harper. Was he myth or truth? And why had the ocean chosen Mason, out of all men, to find this? Kaiser pressed close to his leg, amber eyes steady. Mason laid a hand on the dog's head, grateful for the presence of another witness. Whatever lay ahead, they had crossed a threshold. Life would not return to what it had been the day before. The morning broke pale and heavy, fog rolling low across the harbor as Mason Cole stood at the end of his dock, staring at the canvas-draped chest. The initials carved into the wood, and the silver locket he had found the day before weighed on him like stones. The storm had passed, but its echo remained in his chest, a pressure he could not shake. He knew enough about war to understand that answers rarely came from guessing. If he wanted truth, he needed records, words, something tangible that spoke across time. That meant the town's library, a place he had not stepped into in years. Mason was not a man of books. In the Army, orders were always short, direct, life and death, reduced to coordinates and maps. But now, retired and restless, he realized knowledge might be his only weapon. He pulled on his yellow waterproof jacket again, boots heavy with dried salt, and whistled. Kaiser bounded to his side, ears forward, tail swaying once before settling into a steady gait. The dog was as disciplined in civilian life as he had been on missions, responding to Mason's tone more than his words. Together, they walked up the gravel road toward the town square. The village was modest, brick front shops leaning against each other, paint peeling from years of sea air, streets mostly empty at this early hour. A few fishermen nodded at him, though most kept their eyes down. Mason had long lived at the edge of the community, respected enough but never fully part of it. He liked it that way. The library stood at the corner of the square, a weathered, clapboard building with tall windows clouded by age. Its steps sagged in the middle, worn smooth by decades of feet. Mason paused at the door, brushing rain from his cap before pushing it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old paper, and faint mildew. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, scattering across rows of wooden shelves filled with books that leaned as if tired of standing. Behind a wide oak desk sat a woman in her 50s, her frame slender but upright, with a neat bun of chestnut hair streaked silver. Her glasses rested halfway down her nose, giving her sharp gray eyes an air of perpetual scrutiny. Her nameplate read Margaret Holloway. She was the kind of woman who had lived her entire adult life among words, and it showed in the precise way she moved, every gesture careful, as if she feared disturbing the quiet order of the place. She greeted him with a voice soft but firm. "We don't see you here often, Mr. Cole." Mason nodded, his voice gravelly. "Been a while. I'm looking for old records, mid-1800s, anything about Confederate ships off this coast." Margaret raised an eyebrow, studying him. Most people came here for novels, school books, or the occasional newspaper. His request was unusual, but she did not pry. Instead, she stood, her long gray skirt brushing the floor, and gestured for him to follow. "This way. The archives are in the back. Careful, some of the papers are fragile." She unlocked a small room with a heavy brass key. The air inside was cooler, thick with the scent of aged parchment. Cabinets lined the walls filled with yellowed newspapers, leather-bound journals, and faded maps. A single wooden table stood in the center, its surface scratched from years of use. Mason sat, Kaiser settling at his feet, tail curled protectively. The dog's presence drew Margaret's attention for a moment. Her expression softened, a rare smile ghosting her lips. "A handsome animal," she said quietly, then left them in silence. Mason began leafing through brittle newspapers from the 1860s, the ink faded but legible. Hours passed, punctuated only by the soft creak of his chair and the scratch of his glove against paper. He scanned the headlines of battles, politics, and obituaries until one small article caught his eye. August 1864. The Magnolia Belle presumed lost at sea. His heart thudded as he read. The report was brief, barely half a column. The ship had been traveling north along the coast, rumored to carry both Confederate officers and valuable cargo intended for Richmond before the city fell. No survivors were reported, no wreckage found. Yet, among the listed passengers was a name: E. Harper. Mason whispered it aloud, the letters tasting of memory. Elijah Harper. The note described him as a colored man of approximately 35, serving as translator and navigator, granted exemption from conscription. Mason leaned back, exhaling through his teeth. Here it was, ink on paper, not rumor but fact. His grandfather's stories had always sounded too fantastical to believe, but here was proof. He dug deeper, tracing through the shipping manifests. In one ledger, he found reference to cargo labeled S-17, marked for secured transport, listed as containing medicinal supplies, coin reserves, and personal effects. But in the margin, a faint note had been added by some clerk. Special consignment. Records of passage. The handwriting was barely legible, but the words seared into Mason's mind. Records of passage. Lists of names, perhaps, of people moved under secrecy. Could it be that the chest he had hauled from the water was not merely treasure, but testimony of lives saved? Kaiser shifted, pressing his nose against Mason's knee, sensing his quickened heartbeat. Mason stroked the dog's head absently, eyes still scanning pages. He imagined Elijah Harper standing on the deck of the Magnolia Belle, guiding her through storm and tide, carrying not just gold, but the hopes of men and women whose lives were reduced to names on secret lists. Mason felt a stirring inside him, a pride mingled with sorrow. If Elijah had been kin, then his blood carried more than just soldiering. It carried resistance, defiance, and compassion. Margaret returned quietly, carrying a small box. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, setting it down. Inside were fragments of journals recovered from estates long since abandoned. One entry, dated days before the ship's disappearance, mentioned a Harper by name, advising against sailing due to weather. The author, a Confederate officer, noted with irritation that Harper was insistent but overruled. The last line read, "He vanished with the sea." Mason closed the book slowly, his hands tightening around its edges. The words felt personal, as if history had brushed directly against his life. Margaret studied him from across the table, her expression unreadable. "You found something that matters to you?" she said softly. Mason met her gaze. "It matters to more than me." He stood, packing the papers back with care. He had seen enough for today. When he stepped back into the daylight, fog had lifted, and the sun gleamed faintly across the water. Mason felt as though the air itself had shifted, heavy with meaning. Kaiser walked at his side, steady and silent. The chest waiting at his dock was no longer just a curiosity. It was a fragment of buried truth, a key linking past to present. Mason knew with absolute certainty what he held was both treasure and testimony, and it was no longer possible to turn away. By the time the sun had slipped beneath the horizon that evening, Mason Cole already sensed the shift in the air around town. Small places like this had a way of making secrets leak faster than water through a cracked hull. He had only been to the library once in months, yet already whispers carried. The grocer had eyed him differently when he purchased coffee that morning. The clerk at the hardware store had asked if he was fixing up something big down by the dock. Mason had answered with the same gruff brevity he used in the army, but the look in their eyes told him enough. Something had been noticed. That night, as the moon hung pale over the coast, Mason sat on the porch of his shack with Kaiser at his side. The dog's ears pricked forward every few minutes, nose twitching at scents carried on the salt wind. Mason sipped lukewarm coffee, gaze fixed on the dock where the canvas-draped chest still lay secured. The waves whispered, but beneath their rhythm was something else, an unease he had known on patrols overseas, that subtle electricity before danger surfaced. The first test came in the form of Jace Milner. Mason had seen the man around town for years, a wiry figure with the look of someone who had drifted through more failures than successes. Jace was in his early 40s, but carried himself like a man twice as weary, his face narrow with sharp cheekbones, patchy stubble clinging to his jawline. His dark hair always seemed greasy, tucked under a cap stained with sweat. He had once worked odd jobs at the marina, cleaning nets, hauling fuel, but was better known for lingering in bars and dealing in quick trades that skirted legality. Jace lived for schemes. Rumors were coined to him, and greed lit his restless eyes. Jace did not come alone. Mason noticed two other men shadowing him in the days after the library visit. One was tall and broad-chested with arms inked and faded tattoos, a man called Ray Tucker, known for short tempers and fists quicker than words. The other was thinner, pale-faced, with watery eyes that never seemed to blink, known only as Carl, a drifter who worked on shrimp boats when sober. Together they lingered near the square, their voices dropping when Mason passed, their gazes slipping to wire the path that led down to his dock. By the third night, Mason was certain that they would make a move. He prepared the way soldiers always prepare, quietly, deliberately. He checked the locks on his shed, adjusted the rope securing the chest, and placed a lantern inside with its wick trimmed low. He moved his old crowbar and mallet within reach, weapons not of offense but defense. And he spoke to Kaiser, voice low, commanding in a way that stirred old instincts in the retired K-9. The dog responded instantly, body alert, growl low in his throat at the sound of unfamiliar engines in the distance. It was close to midnight when Mason heard the crunch of gravel outside. His heart slowed, steadying in that peculiar calm that combat had etched into him. He flicked off the lamp, leaving the shack in shadow, and peered through the slit of curtain. Headlights glowed briefly before cutting off. Doors slammed softly. Then came whispers carried faintly on the wind. Three shapes moved down toward the dock. Jace led, crouched low, a crowbar in his grip. Ray followed, bulk heavy against the starlight, while Carl hovered nervously behind. They worked the lock of the shed quickly, fumbling with tools, unaware of the silent presence moving behind them. Mason slipped out the back door, his boots quiet against damp earth, body moving as it had in another lifetime. Angles, cover, patience. Kaiser padded at his side, silent but trembling with restrained energy. As Jace bent to pry the door, Mason gave a sharp whistle. Kaiser exploded forward, barking with the raw authority of a war dog. The sound ripped through the night, echoing off the water. Jace staggered back, dropping his crowbar, eyes wide. Ray swore, fists up, but Mason was already on them, his figure emerging from the shadows like a storm. His voice cut cold and sharp. "Step away!" The three froze. Mason's face was set, jaw tight, shoulders squared in the stance of a man who had faced worse odds. Kaiser circled, growls deep, teeth bared. For a moment the air itself seemed to pause, waiting. Then Mason stepped closer, crowbar in his hands, gaze fixed on Jace. "I've seen scavengers before," he said evenly. on battlefields and alleys, in broken cities, and they all had one thing in common. They didn't last long. Ray muttered something about just curious, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Carl backed away, muttering under his breath, clearly spooked by Kaiser's snarls. But Jace, always more reckless, spat on the ground. "You pulled something out of the sea, old man. Everyone's talking. You don't get to keep it to yourself." His words were bluster, but his eyes betrayed greed. Mason did not flinch. He stepped forward until the crowbar glinted in moonlight. "You come back here, and you won't find a quiet old man. You'll find the army still in me." He snapped his fingers, and Kaiser lunged just enough to snap teeth inches from Jace's boot. The man stumbled back, his bravado cracking. With a hissed curse, he motioned for the others, and they retreated, vanishing into the dark with the sound of tires spitting gravel. Mason exhaled slowly, tension loosening in his shoulders only after the silence returned. Kaiser pressed against his leg, still alert, but Mason stroked his head with a hand that trembled slightly. He had won tonight, but he knew better than to believe it was over. Secrets did not stay buried once greed had smelled them. The next morning, Mason sat at the dock watching gulls wheel overhead. He knew the chest was no longer safe. Hiding it here in a shed vulnerable to desperate men would invite more attempts. His mind weighed options. He could bury it. Deeper, sink it back into the sea, or move it inland. But another idea took hold. Reach out to someone he trusted, someone who had stood beside him in other battles. That someone was Hank Wallace, a man Mason had served alongside in joint operations years ago, though Hank had worn the blue uniform of the Coast Guard. Hank had been a steady figure even in chaos, broad-framed with a square jaw and steady blue eyes. Years at sea had turned his skin to bronze and carved deep lines at the corners of his eyes. Hank was retired now, living a quieter life, but he still carried the authority of a man who had once commanded crews in storms. More importantly, Hank was incorruptible, a man Mason knew would not be swayed by whispers of gold. Mason walked back to the shack and pulled out the old phone book he rarely touched. He dialed the number slowly, hand firm. When Hank answered, his voice was deeper than Mason remembered, but warm. "Cole? Been a long time." Mason wasted no words. "I need your help. It's about history, and it's not safe for me to keep alone." Hank paused, then said simply, "Tell me when and where." Mason also knew he needed more than muscle. He needed truth, verification. So later that afternoon, he phoned the Historical Commission in the state capitol, requesting contact with a field historian who specialized in Civil War maritime records. The name they gave him was Dr. Allen Reeves, a man in his mid-40s, tall, thin, with sandy hair cut neatly and round glasses perched on his nose. Reeves was known for his calm patience, his voice carrying the precision of academia, but softened by genuine curiosity. Mason did not know him personally, but Reeves's reputation for integrity gave him confidence. By the time the calls were done, Mason felt both lighter and heavier. He had drawn allies into the circle, but in doing so, he had widened it. The chest was no longer just his burden. Soon, others would know its weight. He looked at Kaiser, lying on the dock with head resting on his paws, eyes watchful. "We've started something we can't stop now," Mason murmured. And deep inside, he knew the sea had given him not only a chest of secrets, but a reckoning. The morning after the confrontation with Jace Milner and his men dawned clear and sharp, the kind of day where the ocean looked deceptively calm, as though nothing dangerous had ever stirred its depths. Mason Cole rose before sunrise, shoulders heavy with the sleeplessness of a man who knew eyes were watching him even when no figures appeared. The chest still lay under canvas on his dock, solid, immovable, carrying with it a silence that pressed into his very bones. Kaiser sat nearby, tail curled around his haunches, amber eyes alert as always. The German shepherd had not forgotten the night before. His ears flicked toward every distant engine, every gull cry, his body taut as though waiting for another intruder to creep out of the shadows. Mason crouched beside the chest, running a gloved hand along the rough wood. He had told Hank Wallace and Dr. Allen Reeves to come in 2 days' time. He intended to show them the chest and its contents, to verify it all before greedy hands could try again. Yet something gnawed at him, a thought seeded by Kaiser's behavior in the earlier days. The dog had pawed at the bottom more than once, insistent in that way only an old service animal could be. Mason knew better than to ignore instincts sharpened by years of training. He fetched a pry bar and lantern, setting them on the dock planks. Kaiser immediately rose, stepping closer, nose pressed toward the same panel at the chest's base. Mason knelt, tracing the wood. At first glance it looked solid, but closer inspection revealed faint seams, subtle gaps where nails had been driven long ago. The wood was swollen, splintered from salt, but there was something beneath. He inserted the pry bar and pressed. The panel resisted, creaked, and then shifted with a reluctant groan. Dust and rot spilled out, but so too did something else. A second compartment, dark and narrow, hidden for a century and a half. Inside were bundles wrapped in waxed cloth, tied with faded ribbon. Mason lifted one, hands trembling, and peeled back the fabric. A letter fell into his palm, the paper yellowed but astonishingly intact. He held it carefully, eyes scanning the handwriting, elegant and curved in a style of another age. "My dearest Elijah," it began, "though the sea keeps us apart, I send these words with faith that you will carry them in your heart. Your steadfastness is my strength. In the storm, I trust you will hold fast, as you always have." Signed at the bottom was a name, Isabel. Mason sat back on his heels, the letter trembling in his hands. The locket he had found earlier now had a voice to match the face. Isabel was real. Flesh, blood, love, inked into words that had never reached their destination. He imagined Elijah Harper tucking these letters into the hidden space, promising himself he would return to them one day. But the sea had swallowed the Magnolia Belle, and the letters had slept here instead, waiting for someone bound by blood to uncover them, set the bundle aside, and reached for another. This one was heavier, bound tighter. When he untied it, sheets spilled out, lists written in a steady hand. Names upon names, each with notes beside them. Children's names, adults' names, entire families. Many bore the annotation safe or north. Others carried question marks or faint smudges, as though hurried hands had written them on a rocking deck. Mason's breath caught as he realized what they were. Records of people ferried from the south toward freedom. Refugees, freedmen, perhaps even children escaping the grasp of bondage. He turned another page. At the bottom of one sheet, a phrase stood out. Cargo S-17 delivered. Safe passage confirmed. Mason froze. The ledger at the library had mentioned Cargo S-17. The Confederate manifest had reduced it to medicinal supplies and coin. But here, hidden in this secret compartment, was the truth. Cargo S-17 had not been gold alone. It had been lives. and Elijah Harper had been more than a navigator. He had been a rescuer. Kaiser whined softly, sensing Mason's racing heart. Mason placed a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. His eyes caught on one last bundle deep in the compartment. He pulled it free, unwrapping it with slow care. Inside lay a map, hand-drawn on thick parchment. Coastal inlets sprawled across it, familiar to Mason's own eyes from years of fishing these waters. But one cove was marked with a dark X, ink pressed deeper than the rest. In the margin, faint words read, "Hold here what must never fall into their hands." Mason sat in silence, the weight of history pressing around him. Letters of love that had never reached their reader. Lists of names of those saved or lost. A map pointing toward yet another hidden cache, perhaps more documents, perhaps more testimony. This was not just treasure. This was truth. Proof that men like Elijah had risked everything, not for riches, but for freedom. Mason's throat tightened. He thought of his grandfather, of those long evenings when tales of Elijah Harper had been told as half myth. How many times had he laughed them off? How many times had he rolled his eyes at stories of heroes in his bloodline? And now, here it was, undeniable, written in ink that had outlasted nations. His mind turned to Hank Wallace and Dr. Allen Reeves. He had planned to show them the chest as it was, but now he realized the stakes were higher. If word spread that the chest contained not only gold, but names. Names tied to liberation, names tied to defiance of Confederate power, then greed would not be the only threat. Politics, anger, revisionists who would rather the past stay buried, all of them would descend. Mason's hands tightened into fists. He had fought wars to protect truths men wanted hidden. He would do the same again, even here on the edge of retirement. As the sun lifted higher, painting the water with gold, Mason carefully rewrapped the letters and lists, tucking them back into the false bottom. He nailed the panel shut again, leaving only faint traces of its seam. The weight inside the chest felt heavier than ever, but in a way that steadied him. This was no longer about money. This was about legacy. Elijah Harper had carried secrets across storms, and now Mason carried them too. That night, as he sat on the porch with Kaiser stretched at his feet, Mason unfolded one of Isabel's letters again. He read the words aloud softly, his voice rough but steady. "Your steadfastness is my strength." The sentence caught in his throat, and he closed his eyes. He was no longer a solitary man guarding a chest of wood and iron. He was a keeper of voices that history had almost erased, and that knowledge bound him to what must come next. The call to Hank Wallace had been short, but Mason Cole knew his old comrade would come. By late afternoon, the steady rumble of a familiar truck carried down the gravel road toward the dock. Mason stepped out of the shack, Kaiser bounding forward with ears high and tail stiff, half guard, half greeting. The truck rolled to a stop, and out stepped Hank, a man who seemed built from the same oak that had weathered the sea for decades. He was in his early 60s now, his once black hair turned silver, his frame still broad under a navy work jacket. His face was etched with deep creases that spoke of storms faced, not just at sea, but in the long aftermath of service. His handshake was firm, his eyes still carrying that sharp blue steadiness Mason remembered from their shared patrols years ago. "Cole," Hank said simply, voice like gravel rubbed against steel. "You said it was urgent. Let's see it." Not long after, a second vehicle arrived, more modest, a state-issued sedan that carried Dr. Allen Reeves. The historian emerged with a leather satchel slung across one shoulder, tall and thin, his sandy blonde hair trimmed neatly. His round spectacles caught the low sun, and his features bore the pale intensity of a man more comfortable with books than with storms. Yet his grip when he shook Mason's hand was steady, and his eyes burned with curiosity the moment they settled on the canvas-draped chest. Mason led them to the dock, pulling back the canvas. The chest sat dark against the weathered planks, its iron bands scarred with rust, initials faintly visible. Reeves crouched instantly, fingertips brushing the wood with reverence. 19th century craftsmanship, he murmured. Unbelievable condition given the salt water. Hank folded his arms, gaze never leaving Mason. You told me this wasn't just a fisherman's find. Show us. Mason lifted the lid. Inside, carefully rewrapped, lay the oilcloth bundles, the silver locket, the map, and now, though he hesitated, letters from Isabel and the list he had uncovered in the false bottom. Reeves adjusted his glasses and leaned close, carefully untying the ribbon around one bundle. He unfolded the parchment with delicate hands. His breath caught. Good God, these are names. Passenger logs, perhaps? No, more than that. Notes of safe passage. This is abolitionist evidence. Hank's brow furrowed, lines deepening. You're saying this chest carried proof of smuggling people to freedom? Reeves nodded, eyes wide. And more. These letters. Isabel to Elijah Harper. These are personal artifacts of extraordinary value. This isn't just treasure. This is testimony. It rewrites part of our maritime history. Mason stood silent, watching them absorb what he had carried alone. Reeves handled each item with painstaking care, making notes in a small leather journal. The historian's voice gained intensity, his calm replaced with passion. The Confederate Manifest Mason mentioned S-17. They disguised it as coin and medicine, but these papers confirm S-17 referred to lives. This is a vault of truth. Hank's gaze shifted back to Mason. You did right calling us, but this won't stay quiet. The law is clear. Under maritime salvage, you're entitled to a finder's share. But once this is reported, it becomes the state. The federal government will get involved. Mason nodded slowly. I don't care about owning it. I care about protecting it, and making sure the story isn't twisted into something it wasn't. The following weeks moved with a speed Mason found dizzying. Hank handled the initial call to the local Coast Guard office, smoothing the process with his authority. Reeves arranged for experts from the State Historical Commission to visit. The dock, once solitary, became a site of controlled activity. Archivists in gloves handled the letters, photographing each piece, cataloging every scrap of parchment. A state lawyer visited, a short, wiry man named Daniel Perez, his suit rumpled from travel, his dark hair combed back tightly. Perez was professional, his tone brisk but not unkind. By salvage law, Mr. Cole, you will receive a finder's award, 30% of appraised value. The rest becomes property of the state for preservation. Mason listened, nodding. Money mattered less than the sense of justice flowing through the process. Yet, when the valuation was finally tallied, the numbers startled him. The gold alone appraised at several $1 million. His share, after legal review, exceeded $2 million. For a man who had lived frugally in a shack by the sea, patching his roof year after year, it felt surreal. But Mason had no desire to hoard. He made his choices quickly. He contacted the town council and directed funds to restore the overgrown African American cemetery at the edge of the county, where headstones had crumbled under vines. He met with a local college dean, a tall black woman named Dr. Patrice Monroe, whose commanding presence was softened by her warm eyes and a voice that carried the rhythm of both scholar and preacher. Together, they established the Elijah Harper Scholarship, designed for young men and women who came from nothing, offering paths Elijah himself had once been denied, and he donated to a national K-9 veteran foundation, placing Kaiser as the symbol for a new branch that would provide medical care and retirement for service dogs abandoned after duty. Kaiser, who had once only guarded Mason in solitude, became a quiet icon. A photographer snapped his picture beside the restored chest, ears upright, muzzle streaked with gray, eyes sharp. The image spread in newspapers, headlines hailing him as the dog who guarded history. Mason could not help but smile. The old German shepherd deserved every bit of it. Months later, Mason attended the unveiling at the State Museum. The exhibit hall was softly lit, cases of glass gleaming beneath spotlights. Crowds shuffled slowly, whispering. At the center, displayed on velvet, lay the silver locket, Isabel's portrait open to the world. Beside it, one of her letters enlarged for clarity, the words, "Your steadfastness is my strength," etched onto a plaque. Another case displayed the lists of names, each annotated with Safe or North. Reeves gave a speech, his voice breaking as he explained how the documents bore witness to a network of lives saved, not lost. Visitors stood in silence, some with tears slipping down their faces. Elderly men clasped their wives' hands. Young students pressed closer to the glass, eyes wide. Mason stood apart, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But when he saw an elderly woman weep openly in front of Isabel's letter, he felt his chest tighten. History was no longer abstract. It had a human face, a human cost, a human love. After the ceremony, Hank clapped a hand on Mason's shoulder. "You gave them more than treasure. You gave them their story back." Mason did not answer, but his eyes softened. For the first time in years, he felt peace. Not the fragile peace of a storm's lull, but the lasting peace of purpose fulfilled. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear, the kind of bright autumn day where the ocean shimmered as if polished by unseen hands. Mason Cole woke early, though sleep had been restless. His reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed lines deepened not just by age, but by weeks of strain, responsibility, and the peculiar gravity of becoming the keeper of a story larger than himself. He pulled on his yellow waterproof jacket out of habit, though today would be spent mostly on land. Kaiser nudged his leg, tail wagging faintly, sensing both ceremony and tension in the air. By mid-morning, the town square near the restored African American cemetery had filled with people. Mason had not seen such a gathering in years. Old men in veteran caps shuffled on stiff legs, mothers kept children in check, and younger faces from the local college clustered in small groups, notebooks in hand, ready to record. At the front of the crowd stood a new granite marker, polished smooth, catching the sunlight. Its surface bore freshly carved words. Elijah Harper, navigator, protector, a steadfast hand in the storm. Beneath it, smaller plaques listed names taken from the salvaged lists, names once nearly erased but now etched permanently into stone. The event was organized by Dr. Patrice Monroe, the dignified scholar who had helped Mason establish the scholarship fund. She stood tall, her frame commanding, but her dark eyes warm as she greeted guests. Her hair was styled in thick braids, wrapped neatly behind her head, and her long coat of deep burgundy contrasted with the pale stone of the memorial. Patrice's voice carried over the crowd, clear and measured. She spoke not of gold or treasure, but of lives, of Isabel's letters, of Elijah's courage, of the children whose names had been found scribbled in the margins of old paper. History is not simply what we inherit, she declared. It is what we choose to preserve, and today we give these names back to time. Mason stood to one side, uneasy beneath the gaze of so many. He had always been a man more comfortable on the deck of a boat, with salt wind in his lungs and work in his hands. Now he was being treated as a kind of custodian of memory. Hank Wallace stood near him, shoulders squared, a steady presence. Dr. Allen Reeves adjusted his glasses repeatedly, clearly humbled to see the words he had once deciphered now set in stone for all to read. As the moment came to unveil the marker, a ribbon stretched across it, white silk tied in a simple knot. Mason had been asked to cut it, but before he could step forward, Kaiser moved with sudden purpose. The German shepherd, coat gleaming in the autumn light, trotted up to the stone and nosed the ribbon. With a swift tug of his jaws, he pulled it free. The silk fluttered to the ground. For a moment, silence hung in the air, then laughter rippled through the crowd, soft but warm, easing the weight of the occasion. Children clapped, veterans chuckled, and even Mason found a grin breaking across his weathered face. In the midst of solemnity, Kaiser had given them something human, something joyful. The ceremony closed with quiet prayers spoken by a local pastor, a stout man with dark skin and a resonant voice named Reverend Samuel Green. His presence was gentle but firm, his words flowing with the cadence of Scripture but grounded in the soil of lived history. "Today," he said, placing one hand on the granite, "the sea has returned what it once tried to keep. Today, the names are spoken again, and they will not be forgotten." In the weeks that followed, Mason returned to a life more familiar, though never the same. He rose with the dawn, taking his small boat beyond the breakers, casting lines into the deep where the ocean's voice still comforted him. Fishing no longer meant survival, it meant rhythm, grounding, the simple labor of a man who had learned not to measure worth in coins. In the afternoons, he volunteered at a veterans association, working with handlers to train retired canines for civilian homes. Kaiser moved easily among them, patient with younger dogs, his scarred muzzle a symbol of endurance. Mason found himself giving quiet instruction, his old soldier's tone returning in ways he had thought long buried. For the first time in years, he felt useful not because he carried a rifle, but because he carried experience others could lean on. At night, when the town lay quiet, Mason would sometimes sit with one of Isabel's letters in hand. He never read them all at once. He savored them slowly, as if carrying a conversation across centuries. Her words reminded him that history was not faceless. It was love, fear, hope. He imagined Elijah Harper reading these letters on a stormy night, clutching them as proof of something worth fighting for. Mason no longer felt alone. He carried Elijah's story, and in some way, Elijah carried his. One evening, Hank joined him on the porch. The old Coast Guard man leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his chest. "You ever think about that map?" he asked quietly. Mason glanced toward the sea, where the horizon bled into the darkening sky. The map, with the X, still rested among the preserved items now cataloged by the museum. It hinted at more secrets buried in hidden coves, perhaps more documents, perhaps nothing at all. Mason shook his head slowly. There will always be more out there. The ocean never gives everything back. But I've had enough. I've found what mattered. Hank nodded, satisfied. The two men sat in silence, Kaiser stretched between them, the sound of waves folding over itself in the distance. Mason felt the truth settle in him like an anchor. The gold had been a spark, but the legacy, names restored, stories told, a love letter finally read, was the real treasure. On the anniversary of the discovery, Mason walked alone to the memorial. The granite gleamed faintly in the dawn light, dew clinging to the carved names. He laid a single white flower at its base. As he stepped back, a breeze stirred from the ocean, lifting the petals gently before settling them again. Mason felt a rare calm wash over him. The sea would always keep its secrets, but for him it had given enough, a family name restored, a reason to stand straighter, and a future to carry with quiet pride. Sometimes the sea does not only return driftwood or rusted relics. Sometimes, by the grace of God, it returns voices once silenced, names once forgotten, love once hidden. Mason thought he had found only a chest of wood and iron, but what he truly uncovered was a miracle of memory, proof that even through storms and centuries, truth will rise again. And, perhaps, that is a lesson for all of us in our daily lives. We may carry burdens, scars, or moments where we feel lost in the waves, yet God's hand, quiet but steadfast, guides us. Just as Elijah Harper's letters surfaced after 100 years, so too can hope surface in our darkest nights. Every small act of kindness, every prayer, every choice to honor the forgotten is its own miracle. So as you return to your day, may you carry this story in your heart. May it remind you that nothing done in love is ever truly lost. God bless Mason. God bless Kaiser. And may the Lord's blessing extend to you and your family, wherever you are watching from tonight. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave us a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more stories that shine light in the shadows. And may God's grace watch over all of us until we meet again in the next story.